Hi, I'm Paul Sullenberger. In this video, we're going to cover the how and why we measure a CeramicSpeed OSPW system's chain length, what the differences cause between a chain that's too short and too long, and the benefits for having an ideal overall setup. The CeramicSpeed OSPW system is designed to give the lowest possible friction while maintaining at least the original shift quality overall. We also want to maintain a quality chain retention, so that way you don't have missed shifts or chain drops without having unnecessary waste in your overall drivetrain. When we take a look at the overall setup, chain tension is a part of the overall chain length and spring tension setup. The length of our chain is going to tell us how much tension and pull forward is occurring on the cage itself. And then with each of our OSPW systems, we feature 2, 3, or 4 different spring tension settings. This backwards force pulls tighter on the chain and allows us to have better chain retention in rough conditions. But when we have smoother conditions, it's desirable to reduce that force so that way we have less overall friction in the drivetrain. In a setup like this, we can see that we have a nice balanced setup visually, but when we go to the extremes in our big cog and our big cassette, we're going to find that there's going to be too little chain length to have a good setup overall. Shifting up through the cassette, you can actually feel the increase in the tension as that spring is pulled further forward and the cage really has to articulate around the cassette. This forward motion, while still having a little bit of free space, still means that we have too much friction for an overall ideal setup, and you're going to be wasting energy, negating the impact an OSPW can provide. Down here at the opposite end of the range, with that longer cage, we can accommodate more chain length here. So while we still have adequate chain tension on the system, we have further distance that the cage could rotate back further, indicating we can run a longer chain. If we were to run too long of a chain, then we're not going to have enough chain tension throughout the system, even with a higher spring tension, increasing the length of this span here between the cranks and the rear derailleur and causing more chain bounce on rough conditions, potentially disturbing the chain from the cassette, missing shift quality, or even causing the chain to come free of the front chain rings. When you follow the CeramicSpeed OSPW chain length measuring guide, you're going to have the same chain length and the same chain tension that we develop and test these systems for on the road around the world throughout our development and what we supply to both pro teams as well as end consumers alike. Following the guide at the end of this video allows you to ensure that you have the adequate setup with optimal efficiency to have the best overall ride experience with your CeramicSpeed OSPW system. We will now demonstrate a system that is installed with too short of a chain, too long of a chain, and then show the adequate and proper setup for both a 1x and a 2x drivetrain arrangement. We'll disconnect this chain and show how the difference of how too short this chain is, and then show what too long of a chain looks like. Now that we've located our quick link, we can disconnect the chain and see how much further the cage could rotate back, indicating an additional length of chain that could be added. We'll hold aside our quick link here, and you can see with some level of cage spring engagement, we still have quite a gap before the chain would close. The ideal length with a little bit of chain engagement is 1 link set shorter and would give us here about 2 links longer in overall chain length for this setup. We'll now go ahead and install a full uncut chain and take a look at the range that offers. Here we have a new, much longer chain installed on this bike. While this would normally give us a good advantage of having lower overall drivetrain friction, it's not a realistic setup that you could actually ride out on the road. While we're in the big ring, we can shift through the rear derailleur and have good chain tension across all the gears. Quite low there in the small cog. But plenty adequate with plenty of range of motion up in the larger cog. But as soon as we drop down into the smaller chainring, we lose functionality with a lack of chain tension overall. Even if you were to never use those gears, this is a setup that's going to cause problems down on the road. So we want to make sure we have an adequate chain tension throughout all gears. This is why when we start for the measuring of our chain length, we always measure the smallest of the chainring arrangement up front. If it's a 1x, it's the only chainring. On a 2x, the smaller inner chainring, and then shift to the smallest available cog in the rear. On many electronic group sets, when you're in the small chainring up front, when present, you may not be able to shift all the way to the smallest cog. This is okay because you're prevented from using that gear when on the road, and you're at the limits of the drivetrain, so having a minimum amount of chain tension will always be present. When you're on a 1x orientation or a mechanical group set, you may be able to shift all the way down to that smallest cog in the rear. And while it's a less than ideal arrangement for normal pedaling to be in that small cog combination, you're still safe and have a minimum amount of chain tension for which the whole system can be based upon. We'll now take a look, further shifting down to the small cog here and seeing how many chain links we could remove from this setup without going too short. This Shimano Dura-Ace group set stops us 2 from the end here, which that difference between an 11, 12, and 13 tooth cog is only really going to impact about 1 total chain length. So not anything that we'd be concerned about, limiting us from getting an ideal chain length or chain tension. Now that we've located our quick link, we can go ahead and disconnect the chain and take a look at how many links could be removed from the chain and still maintain an adequate chain tension without being too short. So, in our small cog up front and the smallest allowable cog in the rear, we can bring our chain together and already see we have a few extra links. And then in a straight line, we want to engage the spring tension just slightly so we know there is forward tension on the derailleur, and then remove 1 full link set. That'll bring us to this point right here, giving a reduction of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 full link combos. Go ahead and cut the chain and reconnect. We'll go ahead now, reconnect our chain, and go through the gears to see the overall combination length. This measurement method, regardless of the spring tension used, we know that we'll have a minimum amount of chain tension throughout the entire drivetrain. As you go into larger tooth counts, that will increase the chain tension as the spring gets pulled forward. And that is an overall known entity within the range of the setup to ensure the best balance of low friction and chain security. So even here in our big combination with the most chain tension, we still have plenty of cage room to move. We're not maxed out overall. We still have a nice easy amount of movement in the chain overall, and we know that we're going to have a good secure setup. We can go to the small chain ring and still have a nice setup, nice low tension for climbing and when you're going to need those easy gears. And then even in our smallest combo here, you're still going to have an adequate amount of chain tension, so that way you don't risk losing the chain from the cog or the chain rings. This setup matches the ideal setup overall and gives you the best performance for your CeramicSpeed OSPW system and maximum efficiency. Next, we'll go through the measuring setup for a 1x drivetrain, showing the same range and options. Now we have an example of a bike with a 1x drivetrain. We have a full uncut chain here installed over our single ring up front and the smallest cog in the rear. And we're going to follow the same method of bringing the chain together, and we need to engage just a slight bit of tension on the rear derailleur, pulling the cage forward slightly, and then subtract 1 full link set. As we can see here, we have almost the perfect length of the chain as is, but that's not going to keep enough tension on the overall system for chain security. So we need to pull forward for that 1 full link removal to keep an adequate amount of tension on the chain and ensure proper chain security. Now with 1 link removed, we will bring in that engagement of the spring and the rear derailleur pulled forward and ensure that we have an adequate amount of spring tension. We'll now go through the gears, check our large cog for the maximum length, and also double check that we have a reliable amount of tension in the small cog here. So now we can see still range and room to move when we're up in the larger end of the gear range. We have an adequate amount of chain tension here, and we'll still have that at the lower end. This matches the overall parameters in which we set up the spring tension settings on the cage and the overall cage geometry and length to make sure that we have a reliable amount of chain tension across the gear range. With these guides in place, you're now ready to go enjoy your ride.